The Prince and Princess of Wales, they are three children, all greeting well-wishers. 7-year-old Prince Louis breaking protocol and snatching some chocolates given to his father.
The Ashworth family had never been comfortable with silence. Not the good kind, anyway. The kind that settles over a room when everyone is thinking the same thing, but nobody wants to say it. That was a silence that fell over the drawing room at Calder Hall on a gray autumn afternoon, the day a world-renowned pianist named Victor Kesler came to visit, and the day 8-year-old Freddie Ashworth learned exactly what it felt like to be laughed at by a room full of adults. Calder Hall was the kind of house that made children feel smaller than they already were. Its ceilings arched upward into shadow. Its windows were tall and narrow and let in cold light rather than warm, and its walls were crowded with portraits of ancestors who all seemed to be frowning at something just past the viewer's shoulder. Freddie's parents, Edmund and Claire Ashworth, were not royalty, but they came from an old and wealthy family whose name meant something in certain circles. Circles that included patrons of the arts, museum boards, and, on this particular afternoon, one of the most celebrated concert pianists alive. Victor Kesler had built his reputation over 3 decades of sold-out halls and unforgiving reviews. He was a man who spoke about music the way a locksmith speaks about locks, as something with a correct combination, discoverable only by the disciplined and the gifted. He did not suffer noise. He did not suffer distraction. And he most certainly did not expect to find either in the drawing room of a family he'd been invited to charm for an afternoon. But there was Freddie, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing at the closed grand piano in the corner like it might do something unpredictable if he looked at it too long. "Ah," Kesler said, tilting his head the way he did when he found something amusing rather than impressive. "The lively one, I take it." A few of the guests chuckled. Freddie smiled too, because smiling was what he'd learned to do when grown-ups laughed. It usually smoothed things over faster than anything else. Kesler's eyes drifted to the piano. "Does he play?" "Not formally," Edmund said before Freddie could answer. "He's only 8. "Ah." Kessler's mouth curved, not quite into a smile. "Such small hands. I suppose every child believes he can play before he understands what the instrument actually demands of him." More laughter, warmer this time, encouraged by Kessler's evident enjoyment of his own joke. Freddie didn't understand the words completely, but he understood the tone, the particular flavor of amusement that comes at someone else's expense, the way children always understand it, the way they can smell rain before it falls. Then Kesler did the thing that would echo through the next several weeks of Freddie's life. "Well then," he said, gesturing grandly toward the piano, "why don't we hear something? Go on. Show us." It sounded playful. It was not. Every eye in the room turned to Freddie. His face went hot. He looked to his mother, then to his father. Neither of them stepped in, not because they didn't care, but because neither of them recognized, in that instant, that this wasn't a game to their son. To them, it was a harmless invitation. To Freddie, it was a trapdoor. "I don't play," Freddie said quietly, shaking his head. "Oh, come now," Kesler said, waving a hand as if brushing away a fly. "Just a few notes. It's only a piano. Don't be shy." And there it was, the joke wrapped in enough kindness that no one could call it cruel, and enough public pressure that no one could call it optional. Not vicious enough to object to, not gentle enough to ignore. Freddie stood frozen, his fingers curled into his palms. He had never once touched that piano, and he certainly wasn't going to start now, in front of 15 adults who were all waiting to see him fail. Claire finally spoke, gently, telling him he didn't have to if he didn't want to. But the moment had already done its damage. Freddie felt it settle into his chest, that particular ache of being too loud for quiet rooms and not good enough for serious ones. Kesler shrugged, almost fondly. "I forget myself sometimes. Children are better suited to running about than to playing." The laughter that followed was polite. It landed on Freddie's shoulders like something heavier than laughter should. He didn't cry. He'd been raised not to. He nodded, stepped back, and folded his hands the way he'd been taught to do when he didn't know what else to do with them. To everyone else in the room, the moment passed and was forgotten within the hour, filed away as nothing more than a mildly awkward beat in an otherwise pleasant afternoon. But something in Freddie had shifted, quietly and permanently, like a stone settling at the bottom of a riverbed. That night, long after the guests had gone and the house had folded itself into darkness, Freddie lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was something else, something he didn't have a word for yet, but which felt a great deal like determination. Because there was something no one in that drawing room knew. Something Freddie had never told anyone, not even his parents. He already knew where a piano was. Not the polished, decorative one downstairs, kept more for appearances than for use, but a different one, tucked away in a disused music room at the far end of the east wing, a room nobody but the housekeeper ever entered anymore. Freddie had found it months earlier while exploring the parts of the house that weren't meant for exploring, and he had claimed it the way children claim things, quietly, completely, and without telling a soul. It was an old upright, its finish dulled with age, several of its ivory keys chipped at the edges. It had belonged, he'd learned from the housekeeper, to his grandmother, a woman who had died before Freddie was old enough to remember her, but who, according to the stories, had once been a serious musician herself before she gave it up for a life that had no room left for pianos. In the piano bench, Freddie had found a stack of old music books, their pages soft and yellowed, filled with his grandmother's handwriting in the margins. Small notes too, exploring the parts of the house that weren't meant for exploring, and he had claimed it the way children claim things, quietly, completely, and without telling a soul. It was an old upright, its finish dulled with age, several of its ivory keys chipped at the edges. It had belonged, he'd learned from the housekeeper, to his grandmother, a woman who had died before Freddie was old enough to remember her, but who, according to the stories, had once been a serious musician herself before she gave it up for a life that had no room left for pianos. In the piano bench, Freddie had found a stack of old music books, their pages soft and yellowed, filled with his grandmother's handwriting in the margins, small notes to herself, fingerings scratched beside difficult passages, a single exclamation point next to a phrase she must have finally mastered after struggling with it. Touching those same pages, sitting at that same bench, made Freddie feel like he was continuing something rather than starting it from nothing. He hadn't told anyone about the piano, not because it was some grand secret, but because it was his, one of the only things in his life that belonged entirely to him, and not to the expectations of being an Ashworth. The morning after Kesler's visit, Freddie woke before the rest of the house and made his way down the east wing corridor, past sleeping portraits and silent hallways, until he reached the little music room. He sat at the old upright, placed his fingers on the keys, and began again the slow work of teaching himself. Weeks passed, then a month. Freddie's visits to the forgotten music room became more frequent, more focused. He was, by nature, a restless child, the kind who fidgeted through church services and made faces at the dinner table when he thought no one was watching. But at the piano, something in him settled. He was learning patience in a way nothing else in his life had ever demanded of him. Kesler's words stayed lodged in him like a splinter that wouldn't work its way out. Children are better suited to running about than to playing. Every time his fingers ached, every time a passage refused to come together, every time he wanted to give up and go outside instead, he thought of that afternoon. The polite laughter, the small and useless feeling that had settled over him. And he kept going. His parents noticed, eventually, that something about their son had changed, though they couldn't quite name what. "He seems different lately," Edmund said one evening, watching Freddie carry himself a little more carefully through the halls, a little less like a boy trying to fill up space, and a little more like one who had found somewhere quiet to put his energy. More settled. Claire agreed, though neither of them guessed that their son was spending hours behind a door in the east wing, teaching himself to play with a seriousness that would have surprised anyone who only knew him from his usual scraped knees and dinner table mischief. One rainy afternoon, Freddie practiced longer than he meant to. The sound of rain against the windows blended with the notes he was playing, and for the first time, he felt like he was making music rather than simply pressing keys in the right order. His fingers were sore when he finally stopped, but underneath the soreness was something new, a kind of quiet pride that came from working hard at something that actually mattered to him. He wasn't trying to keep it a secret exactly. He simply wasn't advertising it. It was his. A place where he didn't have to perform for anyone, where nobody was waiting to see whether he would fail. Then, one evening at dinner, Edmund mentioned an invitation that had arrived that week. An invitation to the Calderbridge Music Trust's annual benefit gala, a serious and prestigious evening held each year to celebrate classical music and raise funds for young musicians' education. The guest list, Edmund noted, included several major figures in the classical world, including, as it happened, Victor Kesler, who had agreed to perform. Something stirred in Freddie the moment he heard the name. The gala was still weeks away, but already he understood, in the vague and instinctive way children understand important things, that this might be his chance, not to embarrass anyone, not to make a scene, but simply to prove that he was more than what one afternoon had made him look like. "It'll be a long evening," Claire told him gently, sensing something in her son's expression she couldn't quite place. "Very formal. Do you think you can manage it?" "I'll be fine," Freddie said, and he meant it, even as his heart raced at the thought. He had changed since that afternoon in the drawing room. Even at 8 years old, he understood what it meant to be humiliated in front of people whose opinions mattered. And he understood, just as clearly, that if people saw him as small and foolish once, they might never bother to look again. The only way to change that, he decided, was to change what there was to see. He kept practicing, quietly and with growing focus, as the date of the gala drew nearer. The Calderbridge Concert Hall was a grand building with a domed glass roof that caught the evening light and scattered it across the marble floor below. The Ashworth family arrived by car, and Freddie sat quietly in the back seat, watching the city lights grow brighter as they approached. This wasn't like the noisy, colorful events he was used to attending as a child, birthday parties, school fetes, the occasional loud family gathering. This was something else entirely. An evening where every note was expected to matter, where musicians performed not merely to entertain, but to be remembered. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed and formal. Patrons and critics and donors mingled beneath the great dome, their conversation low and polished. String music drifting softly through the corridors. Everything about the evening had been designed to feel controlled, elegant, free of surprises. At least, that was the plan. Freddie walked in beside his parents, dressed neatly, holding himself the way he'd been taught. He felt small among the tall figures in dark evening clothes, and yet somehow it seemed like every eye still found him as he passed. Kesler was already there, near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers, his voice carrying easily as he discussed technique and discipline with a small circle of fellow musicians. When his gaze passed over Freddie, there was the briefest of pauses, a flicker of recognition. He remembered the boy. He remembered the afternoon at Calder Hall, the small joke he'd made at the child's expense. To him, it had been nothing, a moment of amusement, quickly forgotten, the sort of thing children shrugged off within the hour. He expected nothing from Freddie tonight. Certainly not confidence. Certainly not talent. As the guests were guided into the main hall, rows of chairs faced a stage where a grand piano waited under soft light. Programs were distributed. Conversation slowly quieted. The gala was about to begin. Freddie sat between his parents, his feet not quite reaching the floor, his hands folded carefully in his lap. The room felt enormous, and the quiet made him more nervous than any noise ever could have. Backstage, Kesler prepared himself, running through the evening's opening passage in his mind, already imagining the applause that would follow. He did not think of Freddie at all. Why would he? To him, the boy was a footnote to a footnote, barely worth remembering, let alone worrying about. The program began. A brief introduction explained the purpose of the gala, the scholarships it funded, the young musicians it supported, the tradition it was meant to honor. Then Kesler took the stage. The applause was respectful, measured. He sat, adjusted his posture, placed his hands on the keys, and the room fell silent. But something went wrong. Not dramatically, not enough for most of the audience to notice right away, but a small mistake crept into the opening passage, small enough to forgive, but large enough for Kesler himself, and for the professionals around him, to feel it keenly. His focus tightened instead of loosening. He pushed against the music instead of settling into it. Freddie listened from his seat. He didn't understand everything about the piece technically, but he understood tension when he heard it, the way any careful listener does. He leaned forward without meaning to, simply absorbed in the sound. When the piece ended, The applause was polite but restrained. Kesler stood and acknowledged it, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, aware that something had slipped through his grasp that he could not quite name. As the program moved into its next segment, there was a brief pause, a quiet, unplanned adjustment behind the scenes. And in that gap, with the room's attention drifting and its composure slightly unsettled, Kesler, perhaps to recover some sense of control over the evening, perhaps simply out of habit, stood again and addressed the audience with a light, half-joking tone. "This evening is meant to inspire the next generation," he said, gesturing loosely toward the front rows. "Perhaps a young guest would like to sit closer to the piano." The room reacted before anyone had time to think it through. A staff member, uncertain, but moving on the assumption that this was simply part of the program, stepped toward the Ashworth's row and gestured gently to Freddie. Claire's hand tightened on the armrest. Edmund leaned forward, unsure whether to object. But there was no clear moment to refuse, and Freddie was already rising, already walking toward the aisle, his heartbeat loud in his own ears. The walk to the stage felt endless. He could feel the room's attention on him. Not warm, not cruel, simply curious. The particular curiosity reserved for children who have wandered somewhere they don't obviously belong. He reached the edge of the stage and stopped, unsure what was expected of him. Kesler looked down at him. From that angle, Freddie looked smaller still. The thought crossed Kesler's mind, briefly and without malice, that this would pass quickly and without incident, that a child, however earnest, could not disrupt an evening built on decades of discipline. Freddie placed his hands at his sides. The piano waited a few steps away. The room waited with it. And then, before anyone could fully register what was happening, Freddie stepped forward. He did not rush. He climbed onto the bench the way he always did in the quiet music room back home, adjusting his seat with both hands, the soft scrape of wood against wood the only sound in the enormous hall. His feet dangled above the floor. He placed his hands above the keys and waited a moment, the way he'd learned to wait, listening for something only he could hear. Then he played. The first note was soft but clear, carrying farther into the hall than anyone expected. A second note followed, then a third, not random, not careless, but measured, deliberate, the product of months spent alone in a forgotten room with an old, imperfect piano and a stack of his grandmother's music. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Programs lowered. Heads tilted forward. This was not noise. This was not a joke. It was a child placing notes with clear intention, in a room full of people who had spent their lives learning to recognize intention the moment they heard it. Freddie continued. The melody was simple but controlled. He did not rush it, did not force it. When a note lingered, he let it linger. When the sound faded, he adjusted, listening to the instrument rather than fighting it.